Today, let's talk about what luxury education has not yet taught. Let me start slightly different here because every time I look at the luxury industry and the talent entering it, I keep coming back to one observation. Luxury has never actually suffered from a shortage of talent. It has suffered from shortage of direction. And I want to pause on that for a second. Because that sounds simple, but structurally it is doing something very deep. Across London, Paris, Milan, New York, Dubai, Los Angeles, and now increasingly across emerging European creative hubs, the system continues to produce highly trained individuals every year. Luxury management, fashion strategy, brand communication, art curation, cultural theory, design innovation. So if you have just looked at the surface, everything seems aligned. The pipeline looks structured, almost efficient. But when you actually enter the system, something slightly uncomfortable starts to appear. And I have seen this consistently across different markets. It is not that people are unprepared. It is that they are slightly misaligned with how the system actually functions today. Let me explain what I mean. They arrive with a very strong narrative intelligence. They understand heritage, they understand brand history, they understand aesthetic codes. They can decode campaigns, they can articulate positioning, they can speak fluently about luxury as a cultural concept. So on paper, they're prepared. But then something happens very quickly once they are inside. They start operating in a system that is no longer behaving like what they studied. And that is where the gap opens, not because education and effort, but between education and system reality. Let me slow this down. Luxury education, as it currently exists, is extremely effective at preserving history. It teaches what luxury was. But luxury today is not operating as history anymore. It is operating as infrastructure. And that is a very different thing. Because history is something you interpret. Infrastructure is something you operate inside of. And infrastructure does not stay still. It adjusts, it responds, it reconfigures depending on pressure. Capital pressure, cultural pressure, technological pressure. So when education evolves slower than the system, it feeds into misalignment, becomes unavoidable. Not occasionally, structurally. Which means something important. Graduates are not underprepared or unprepared. They are contextually mispositioned. And that distinction matters more than people think. Because unprepared means you can fix it with training. Misposition means you are solving the wrong problem inside the system. Now, let me go one layer deeper. Because what actually drives luxury today is not what most people are being taught. Underneath everything visible, there are four operating forces. Positioning intelligence determines visibility. Capital logic determines scale. Timing determines relevance. And cultural precision determines survival. Let me say that again in a simpler way. What you see in a luxury is never the system itself. It is the output of it's the output of system working in the background. But most people are trained to read outputs, not systems. And that is where the disconnect begins. Now, there is another layer here that it is even more important. We are still educating people in what it called narrative fluency, meaning they can explain luxury, they can describe it beautifully, they can talk about brand identity, storytelling, aesthetics, but narrative fluency is not the same as system fluency. System fluency means understanding why something becomes relevant and why something else disappears completely. This is a different level of intelligence. Now, I want to connect this to something happening more broadly in the industry: influence. Because influence has changed shapes. it used to function after visibility. First, something became visible, then influence shaped perception around it. That is no longer the case. Now, influence is often constructed before visibility. Let me explain that. Visibility is not scarce anymore. It is constant. It is engineered. It is algorithmically amplified across platforms. So visibility has stopped being differentiator. It has become ambient. It is just there. And when visibility becomes ambient, it stops signaling value in the way it used to. So the system shifts again and scarcity moves somewhere else. It moves into interpretation. And this is where things becomes interesting, because luxury is no longer defined by what it's seen. It is defined by who is capable of interpreting what is seen. Now I want to slow it down here because this is critical. Interpretation is not opinion. Interpretation is structural reading ability. It is the ability to look at something and understand what is actually producing its meaning underneath the surface. Now, what it looks like, but how it is constructed. And this is where a new archetype emerges in luxury, the modern connoisseur. But I do not mean connoisseur in the traditional sense of excess or taste. That is outdated. Excess is no longer rare here. Taste is no longer enough. The modern connoisseur is defined by something more specific: interpretive precision. The ability to decode intent inside the system of meaning, to understand provenance not as history but as structure, not to see how cultural production connects to economic and institutional logic. And this changes something fundamental. Luxury stops being visual language. It becomes cognitive language. And once that happens, something else changes too. Reading becomes the core skill, not consuming, reading. Now let me connect this to careers, because this is where most people feel the shift personally. Luxury is no longer a linear career system. The old model was very simple. You enter, you progress, you climb. That model assumes stability. But the system is no longer stable in that way. What we now have is a distributed ecosystem. Influence is not held in one place anymore. It's spread across brands, creator, advisor, investors, designer, strategist. And roles are not fixed. They behave more like positions inside a network. And in that kind of system, something changes. Position becomes more important than title. Contribution becomes more important than designation. And relevance becomes more important than tenure. Now, I want to make this practical, because this is where careers actually break or accelerate. If you are highly skilled but placed in a low impact position, the system does not reward that skill. It simply absorbs it. And this is where many young professionals get confused. They think they are not progressing because of ability, but in most cases, it is positioning, not capability. Now, let me slow down here again. Distinction in this system is no longer a static difference. It is structural placement. It is the ability to occupy a position that the system cannot easily replace or ignore. If that is missing, everything becomes noise, even strong work. And noise does not accumulate authority. It disappears. This is also why exhaustion is increasingly in the industry, but not the kind of exhaustion people usually talk about. Not burnout from overwork, but exhaustion from effort that is structurally misallocated. Effort that is real, but not positioned correctly inside the system. Now, at this point, mentorship becomes important. But I think mentorship itself is also changing. Traditional mentorship is motivational. It focuses on encouragement, direction, inspiration. But system we are entering does not need more motivation. It needs interpretation. It needs clarity on where value actually compounds, where attention turns into leverage, where position creates exponential return rather than linear progress. Because clarity is no longer supportive. Clarity is strategic advantage. Now, let me step back and zoom out. Because across global markets, something is already visible. Young professionals are no longer asking how to enter luxury. They are asking how to matter inside it. And that question actually is very important because it signals a shift from participation thinking to influence construction thinking, from visibility seeking to structural authorship, from employment logic to positioning logic. And beneath all of that, something more fundamental is happening. They are starting to understand that visibility without meaning is temporary, and activity without positioning is noise. So, if I bring everything together, the real shift is not surface level, it's structural. Luxury today is no longer about participating in system. It's about understanding how systems are constructed beneath appearance. And that is the divide between those who operate inside the system and those who understand how the system actually works. And in moments like this, the advantage is very clear because systems in transition do not reward repetition. They reward precision. They reward interpretation. They reward structural awareness. And in that environment, the future of luxury is not defined by visibility. It is defined by understanding how visibility itself is engineered. And the highest form of advantage is no longer access, it is alignment. Alignment between culture, capital, and meaning. Because in the new architecture of luxury, alignment is not theory, it is power.